So it is just after 7 o'clock, and I think we'll get going. Latecomers are always, a common thing.
Yeah, people come and go.
Montana time.
Sure.
But here at Bozeman Public Library, we're happy to welcome Ms. Ellen Baumler from Montana Historical Society, nicely renowned historian. And she's here tonight from Humanities Montana to tell us about untold stories of Montana's minorities, specifically African American minorities in Montana. So without further ado, I will mute myself. And Ellen, please take it away.
I'll do that. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the Bozeman Public Library and to you, Corey. And actually, I am retired from the Montana Historical Society now, but I did spend 26 years there. So I still have that on my screen there in case anyone is wondering. So African Americans have made indelible marks on our state, and they have thus contributed significantly to Montana's diverse heritage. You can see from these statistics, and this is the only statistic that I'm going to show you, that Montana's African American population has always been relatively small. But despite the small numbers, this ethnic group has really long been a significant presence in our state. The lighter color there shows the states with the fewest population of African Americans. And the history of this minority on the frontier, however, has really been largely overlooked. I think this is partly because there is a lack of written records, and that's made the historian's task difficult. Newspapers, for example, rarely recorded anything but notorious or infamous items relating to minorities. And really that's because there is an undercurrent of prejudice, however subtle it may have seemed, and negative stories tended to reinforce the inequality that African Americans encountered everywhere, even on the remote frontier. But it's also partly because few historians have sought out their stories. They do exist. And this program will share some of the stories of some of our well-known Black Montanans and some whose stories are not so well known. So let's begin with York, who was likely the first African American to set foot on what would become Montana. York accompanied the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805 and 1806 across Montana and back. York was William Clark's slave, but according to journal entries, he was a valued member of the group and an equal among the other men. York is portrayed here in the work of C.M. Russell. In the right-hand side there, you can see York in the pirogue. And also here in the Mandan village, York was the very first person, Black person Native Americans had ever seen. And so they tried to rub the black off his skin, and that's what's going on in the painting there. That Clark valued York is especially evident in his naming a geographic feature after him. Even today, York's Islands are remembered and honored as a fishing access near Townsend. A little after Lewis and Clark's historic trek across Montana, James Beckworth worked as a trapper for the American Fur Company in the 1820s, and he was adopted into the Crow tribe. The Crow gave him the name Medicine Calf. He left as his legacy a valuable description of the Montana wilderness, the fur trading industry, and Fort Cass, which was the first Crow trading post established by the American Fur Company in 1832. There are some who would blame the terrible smallpox epidemic of 1837-1838 on this individual, although that blame is most certainly misplaced. Blacks were recruited to serve in the Civil War, and many did serve, but they were often assigned tasks that others wouldn't do. African-American veterans came to Montana among the early pioneers, and one of those veterans was Isaiah Dorman. He was born free in Pennsylvania, ventured west, arrived in California between 1849 and 1853 as the body servant of US Army officer Alfred Sully, who was stationed at Monterey. He remained with Sully during the Civil War when Sully commanded US troops in the Dakota Territory. He married a Lakota Sioux woman and lived with the Sioux. He spoke their language fluently and knew their customs very well. He was hired as a civilian courier and carried the Army payroll. And in 1871, he served as a guide and escort for the Northern Pacific Railroad surveyors as they scouted the route the railroad would later take through Montana. Dorman then became post interpreter at Fort Rice in North Dakota. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer requested his services as US Army interpreter, and then Dorman fell at the Little Bighorn in 1876. He fought valiantly against his one-time friends, the Lakota Sioux, and fell in battle with a mixed group of civilians and scouts. He was the only known African-American to die in the battle. One story goes that Sitting Bull found Dorman on the battlefield, severely wounded and dying. The chief gave Dorman water in his personal drinking horn, which was quite an honor, and said to his companions, "This is the black white man. He used to be one of us." In what was likely a sign of respect, Dorman's body was not desecrated, even though some of the bodies of Custer's other men were. Dorman was buried on the battlefield with the other fallen soldiers. And it's interesting that only his last name or his first name appears on the monument. To me, that seems like not a very fitting tribute to someone who gave their life for their country. Okay, so Samuel Lewis, who was from Bozeman, hailed from Haiti, or maybe the West Indies, or maybe Bermuda, as his birth is recorded in various different places in official documents. We do know that he was a musician. He played the violin and the harp. He was a sleight of hand expert and a barber. He came to Montana with the gold rush, first to Virginia City in 1863, to Helena in 1864, and then settled in Bozeman in 1868, where he set up shop. Lewis became a highly successful businessman, operating his barbershop and bathing parlors when hot baths were a real luxury. He owned a lot of property that you see here in the sketches, and built one of the town's finest homes, which is pictured there in the lower left. That was built in 1885 along with some of his other properties. So this house is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and it is a Bozeman landmark. With the fortune that he made in Montana, Lewis financed the education of his sister, Edmonia, sending her to Boston and abroad to Paris, France, and Florence, Italy, where she became a sculptress of world renown. Edmonia was the first Black sculptor to celebrate the emancipation. Her Forever Free, completed in 1868, celebrates the heritage and freedom of African Americans. Lewis married Melissa Bruce, who came to Bozeman with her husband, Charles, from St. Joe, Missouri, around 1870. All 6 of the Bruce children were born in Bozeman. Charles died in 1881, and Melissa then married Samuel Lewis in 1883, and the couple had 1 child. Here you see the Lewis tombstone in Sunset Hills Cemetery. So when Samuel Lewis died in 1896, the funeral was held in the house, and the mayor of Bozeman was a pallbearer. By 1910, only 3 of Melissa's 7 children were living. Melissa lived in the house until her death in 1927. Oops. Hold on just a second here. Let me do that. Oops. Sorry, there's always a little glitch. Here we go. Richard and Mary Mcdonald were born into slavery. Mary's mother was sold away from her when she was very small. She and Richard married in Missouri, and upon the emancipation in 1863, their owner granted them freedom, even though the emancipation did not include border states like Missouri. So the couple came west in a wagon train, buried their firstborn son along the way, and then first settled in Virginia City. Virginia City was too wild, and so they came to Bozeman in 1864, where the family then remained. Richard worked hard freighting, and they built what was perhaps Bozeman's first two-story home, with their own first cabin as the core of the house. And that was built in 1872 or thereabouts. The Mcdonalds had 4 sons and 3 daughters, but unfortunately only the daughters survived to adulthood. The home subsequently housed 3 generations of the Mcdonald family, and they lived in the house for the next 128 years. Not as grand as the Lewis House, perhaps, but just as historic and also listed in the National Register. The surviving Mcdonald women enjoyed great longevity and were active in Montana's close-knit Black community. Sarah Bickford triumphed over the worst kind of adversity to become one of Montana's pioneer businesswomen. She was born into slavery in Tennessee. Her parents were sold and she never saw them again. Upon emancipation, Sarah went to live with an aunt, and at 15, she came west by covered wagon with the John L. Murphy family. Murphy was headed to Virginia City to serve as Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court. The Murphys, however, stayed only a very brief time and returned east, but Sarah decided to stay. She worked as a hotel chambermaid and soon married miner William Brown. The couple had 3 children, but by 1880, 2 of the children had died. In 1880, Sarah took it upon herself to hire an attorney and sue for divorce. She did win custody of her daughter, her oldest daughter, Eva, who lived to be 9 years old, and then Eva died. So Sarah had absolutely no one, and she had to start completely over. She married Stephen Bickford, who was a white miner who was the owner of the Virginia City Water Company. The Bickfords then had 4 children, and as those children grew up, Sarah often told them stories of her other family. Stephen died in 1900, and Sarah inherited the water company and learned to run it by taking night courses. There were a number of mixed marriages like the Bickfords in the 19th century in Montana. However, in 1909, the Montana legislature passed a law making mixed race marriages illegal, and it was not rescinded in Montana until 1953. So this Virginia City building is well known for the quintuple hanging that occurred on its crossbeam in 1865, but it's also famous as the office of the Virginia City Water Company. Sarah Bickford did business here from 1900 until her death in 1931, and she was the only Black woman in the nation to own a utility. Sarah was inducted into the Gallery of Outstanding Montanans in the Capitol, in the Montana State Capitol in 2012. Now, Sarah Bickford is sometimes touted as Virginia City's first Black businesswoman. While her contribution is certainly important, the claim is probably not true. Consider sisters Minerva Cogswell and Parthenia Sneed. The 2 were also born into slavery. With the emancipation and the gold rushes in Montana, the 2 came west from Missouri. Photos of Virginia City from the 1880s show loads of laundry hanging at the back of this property. But even before this, we know that the sisters operated this restaurant on Wallace Street. Parthenia married and moved to Butte, but Minerva continued to take in laundry and boarders and may have run a restaurant out of her cabins. When she died in 1894, Jack Taylor bought the property from her estate. Taylor was a longtime African-American resident of Virginia City who had boarded at Minerva's since the very early days. He had served in the Union Army during the Civil War and arrived at Virginia City in 1866 as a teamster. He eventually owned considerable property, including land and livestock. In 1906, Taylor figured in a well-publicized trial. He accused Thomas Thexton, who was the son of a prominent Virginia City blacksmith, of horse rustling. To prove his point, he had one of the elderly horses killed, and the prosecution brought the branded hide in as evidence. The jury deliberated 20 hours before delivering a guilty verdict, and Thexton served a year in prison at Deer Lodge. Jack Taylor's tombstone in Hillside Cemetery above Virginia City recalls a life of honest labor. Its epitaph reads, "As long as the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest shall not cease." Mary Fields was a colorful personality well known to old timers around Cascade, and she's especially interesting because at a time when women seldom enjoyed much freedom, Mary held her own and lived her own way in a world where odds were stacked against her. She dressed as she pleased in a man's cap and boots and packed a revolver under her apron. At 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, she was said to be a match for any man in Montana territory. She had a standing bet that she could knock out any man with one punch. And by order of the mayor of Cascade, she was the only woman of reputable character in the town allowed to drink in the local bar. And while she enjoyed that privilege, she never drank to excess. She smoked cigars in public and liked to argue politics. Mary Fields was born a slave in Tennessee, and after the Civil War, she moved to Mississippi, where she got a job emptying chamber pots into the Mississippi River aboard the steamer Robert E. Lee. In 1872, Mary worked for a private family and accompanied her employer's children to Toledo, Ohio, to attend school at the Ursuline Convent. When the children finished school, Mary stayed on with Mother Superior Amadeus, and there Mary learned to read. Mother Amadeus left Ohio in 1884 to take charge of St. Peter's Convent near Cascade, Montana, that you see there on the screen. When Mother Amadeus became gravely ill with pneumonia, Mary rushed to Montana, nursed her back to health, and remained at St. Peter's. She drove the stage back and forth from the train station with passengers and supplies. She tended the mission gardens, raised chickens, and did the laundry. And she fought with her fists, became a crack shot with a revolver and a rifle, and smoked her cigars. Mary got into a heated debate with a rancher, using a rock and the rancher's head to make her point. Unfortunately, Bishop John Brondell was appalled and ordered the sisters to fire her. Mother Amadeus moved Mary to nearby Cascade and secured the mail route between Cascade and the convent for her. So for the next 8 years, Mary delivered the mail. She was the second woman in the US to manage a mail route. Mary gave up her mail route at age 70 and ran several restaurants, but she was so good-hearted that she gave away the money she made. Artist C.M. Russell featured Mary in this pen and ink drawing, which shows a hog knocking her down and spilling a basket of eggs there in the center. Mary claimed the incident never happened, but Russell maintained that the drawing was a composite of real events that happened in Cascade at different times. Actor Gary Cooper, who knew Mary when she babysat him as a small boy, wrote about her in a story published in Ebony magazine in 1959. Mary babysat scores of children and spent most of what she made buying treats for them. In 1912, when her home and laundry business burned down, the townspeople all gathered to build her a new house. She died in 1914 and is buried there at St. Peter's Mission. Millie Ringgold was born a slave in Virginia in 1845. After emancipation, she traveled to Fort Benton as the nurse and servant of a US Army general. She remained in Fort Benton and ran a boarding house. Gold discoveries in the Judith Basin compelled Millie to sell her boarding house and buy 2 condemned Army mules, provisions, and whiskey, and set out for Yogo City in 1878. There, she set up a hotel, restaurant, and saloon, and for a couple of years mined the miners and did very well. 20 years later, there was no gold left, but white linen still adorned the tables in her restaurant. Miners claimed Millie made the most beautiful music with mouth harps, band saws, washboards, and dishpans. They said that she could make more music with an empty 5-gallon can than most people could playing a piano. But Millie's burst of prosperity ended, and she eked out less than a meager living raising a few chickens and turkeys. She never lost hope that the town would rebound, but she died destitute in 1906 and was buried in a piano crate in the cemetery at Utica. Black military troops first came to Montana in 1888 and served at many of Montana's forts, including Fort Missoula, Fort Keogh, Fort Custer, Fort Assiniboine, and Fort Shaw. Companies of the 10th Cavalry were among the very first arrivals, shown here at Fort McGinnis near present-day Lewistown. Here they're tending their horses, and of course for the cavalry, equine care was among their most important duties. Here, the soldiers are wearing Army-issued white coats for stable duty. Buffalo Soldiers was the name Plains Indians first gave the 9th and 10th Cavalry, but because of their curly hair, their curly hair and the heavy buffalo coats that they wore. But the name then soon became synonymous with all 4 of the Black military regiments. Companies of Montana's Black infantry and cavalry troops were called up in November of 1890 during the last overall campaign against the Sioux, later known as the Pine Ridge Campaign. Although to their credit, Black troops did not fire a rifle during this campaign, they suffered hardships, bivouacked for several months in Sibley tents in sub-degree 0 weather. Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Shaw under white command explored what would later become Glacier Park. The US government requested Army reconnaissance to discover a pass across the range north of the Marias, and their explorations were dangerous undertakings into Montana's last unexplored territory. Buffalo Soldiers returned to Glacier later and built roads and facilities, created maps, protected the area, and fought fires. It's a little known fact that before the creation of the National Park Service in 1916, Buffalo Soldiers served as the first park rangers, protecting Yosemite, pictured here, Sequoia, Kings Canyon, and Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks here in Montana. African-American soldiers, cavalry soldiers, were given the hardest riding horses. William D. Davis was a Buffalo soldier stationed at Fort Assiniboine when he patented an improvement to the military saddles used by the cavalry. His patent, issued in 1896, added springs to the seat and stirrup that you can see there. Davis saddles, although never standard Army issue, provided a smoother ride for long hours in the saddle. Horace W. Bivens, who was born in Virginia of free ancestry, served in the 10th Cavalry G Company, pictured here. He was formally educated at Hampton Agricultural Institute and Wayland Seminary, and he enlisted in the 10th Cavalry in 1887 under an order to recruit educated men of color as non-commissioned officers. He served in Arizona in Indian campaigns against Geronimo and kept telegraph lines guarded and in good repair. When the 10th Cavalry was reassigned to Montana, Bivens and his fellow soldiers arrived at Billings from the hot desert. They marched to Fort Custer in a blizzard. Bivens made such a name for himself as a marksman at Fort Custer that Buffalo Bill Cody sought him out and offered him $100 a month plus expenses to travel with his show. But Bivens refused and served in both Cuba and the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. At the attack on San Juan Hill, Bivens, who was then a sergeant, operated one of the heavy Hotchkiss guns alone. Each shot rebounded 6 to 8 feet, and Bivens had to reposition and reload each time. After firing a number of times, the gun was no longer serviceable, and he took up a carbine and went among Colonel Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, fighting along with them until the battle was over. Roosevelt built his career on the Rough Riders' supposed actions, but historians say that had it not been for the Buffalo Soldiers, Roosevelt and his men would have been exterminated. This photograph was taken after the battle at San Juan Hill, and it shows the US participants. Black soldiers on the right are usually completely cropped out of this photograph, and only the Rough Riders in the center are usually shown in the photo. So Bivens had an Irish water spaniel that you see there named Booth that he trained at Fort Custer to retrieve and carry messages. Tested for service, Booth passed with flying colors and accompanied the men of the 10th Cavalry to Cuba and to the Philippines. At the battle at San Juan Hill, Booth guarded the remains of a fallen private all day in the hot sun until his comrades could recover the body. The dog later went with Bivens to the Philippines and further distinguished himself. But when his master returned to the United States, Booth was not allowed back into the country for fear of contagion. So he was left in the company of some officers and he disappeared, and we don't know what happened to Booth. Bivens went on to serve during World War I and retired to Billings. He received the Silver Star for his actions at San Juan Hill. Bivens' record for marksmanship stood until the 1970s. During his 32-year career in the military, Bivens received 32 medals, one for every year of service. Black Buffalo soldiers of the 25th Infantry, stationed at Fort Missoula, made up the US Army's only bicycle corps. Dubbed Iron Riders, these dedicated soldiers rode their 70-pound iron bicycles in a grueling 1,900 miles from Missoula to St. Louis in 1896 and 1897, testing the feasibility of troops mounted on bicycles. They pedaled over snow-dusted peaks and across the sweltering Great Plains. And when they finally arrived near St. Louis, 1,000 civilian bicyclists rode out to meet them and escorted them to town in triumphant celebration of their remarkable feat. One of those soldiers was Mingo Sanders, there in the center of the photograph, who had an excellent service record. He was one of few non-commissioned Black officers and, like Bivens, had fought alongside Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders at San Juan Hill. He was wounded and received the Medal of Honor for heroic actions. In 1906, Sanders was stationed at Fort Brown, Texas, a year away from retirement. He and 166 others of the 25th Infantry, many of them members of that famous bicycle corps, were falsely accused of murdering a white bartender. Fabricated evidence and Roosevelt's political agenda led to dishonorable discharges of all the men without a trial. This was known as the Brownsville Affair. Mingo Sanders was blind in one eye and diabetic. He gave most of his life to his country, but he never received his pension. He died in 1929 of complications during the amputation of a gangrenous foot. In 1972, Congress reopened this case and found all 167 men innocent. They received honorable discharges posthumously and $25,000 each in restitution that was paid to their heirs. Only one of those 167 men were still living at the time. During the Great Fire of 1910, the same year Glacier National Park was created, Buffalo soldiers of the 25th Infantry were stationed at Lake Mcdonald, Belton, Nyack, and Essex. The first park superintendent, William R. Logan, could not say enough about their achievements. They fought fires, built roads and trails, and miles of fire guard trenches without complaint. Soldier Mountain near Essex was named for the Black troops that fought that fire. Mary Gordon of White Sulphur Springs was born a slave in Kentucky in 1853. Her husband, John, was a free person of color who came from Scotland to the US with his employer. John was a trained chef and worked as a chef and baker in White Sulphur Springs at the Higgins House, which was the town's main hotel. In 1895, he decided to take a job as chef for a Canadian railway, and soon after that died in a train accident just before the birth of the Gordons' fifth child, Taylor. Mary took in laundry, provided nursing care for the community, and cooked fine dinners for parties given by the town's elite. Daughter Rose did the serving. Rose, one of the Gordon's 5 children, wanted desperately to become a doctor. She graduated valedictorian from the White Sulphur Springs High School in 1903 and had great potential, but never had enough money to go to medical school. She owned 2 restaurants and later became a licensed physical therapist and practical nurse. Unlike most women, she also hunted and fished and bagged 2 elk at the age of 75. The youngest of the 5 Gordon children was Taylor, who led both a charmed and tragic life. His adventures began when John Ringling of circus fame came to town with his chauffeur, John Spencer. Spencer taught Gordon how to be a mechanic, which led to a job as chauffeur and mechanic for the president of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. This connection led him to be discovered, and Gordon made a name for himself as a talented gospel singer and performed in popular vaudeville acts in the 1920s. He toured Europe with his singing group until the group disbanded, and then he appeared on Broadway in several productions. He also published an autobiography, Born to Be. But his career fell apart, and during World War II, Gordon worked as a lathe operator at a B-29 factory in New Jersey. In 1947, he suffered a breakdown and spent 12 years in a mental hospital. He returned home to White Sulphur Springs in 1959 and gave a few Montana concerts and continued his writing. But his only other publication was a history of the castle, which is a local landmark in White Sulphur Springs. Taylor Gordon died quietly in 1971. Unlike some other African-American Montanans, Gordon did not experience much prejudice and discrimination growing up. In his autobiography, he wrote that although he knew his dark skin made him different, his childhood was happy, and he was always free to associate with people of all nationalities, creeds, and colors. The race question, said Gordon, has never been the big ghost in my life. Despite Gordon's positive experience, Montana had a history of segregation. Most churches and social organizations were segregated in Montana Territory. Beginning in 1872 by territorial legislation, so were schools. But financial considerations, likely stemming from the small Black populations, ended school segregation by electorate vote in 1882. Butte's Garfield School was one example of an integrated school, and there you can see 2 little African-American children there in the rather large classroom, group of classmates. African-Americans lived in Butte from the town's earliest days, and some organized their own mining companies, but racism was prevalent. For example, in 1942, during World War II, white miners refused to work with a battalion of Black miner soldiers who had been sent to Butte to help increase copper production. The 8,000 white miners who walked off the job in protest cited safety issues, even though the soldiers were skilled and experienced miners. A few African-American women actually homesteaded alone, and Bertie Brown was one of those who lived near Lewistown. She operated an illegal bar during Prohibition, and everyone knew the rutted road to Bertie's place. She also had a dry cleaning business. She was cleaning some clothing with gasoline in 1933 when the gasoline exploded, and she was fatally burned. She was lucid, never lost consciousness for about 48 hours. And just before she died, her friends gathered around her. She had a black cat that she loved very much. And she, with her last words, asked her friends to please find her cat and take care of it. Well, they never did find the cat. But to this day, the farmer who now owns her place says that occasionally a black cat will appear in Bertie's parlor window. Now, country singer Carrie Wallace took that story that I just told you about Bertie another of my stories about canaries, and immortalized them sort of together, blended them together in the Ballad of Bertie Brown. You can Google it and hear it. It's a really great song. Annie Morgan was an African-American woman who came to Montana at the age of 44 as a cook for George Armstrong Custer in 1876. Well, you can imagine her career at that job didn't last very long because Little Bighorn happened. And she later in the 1890s met a typhoid-stricken man on the banks of Rock Creek. This man was John Case, and she was able to nurse him back to health. It's not easy to bring someone out of typhoid, but she managed to do that, and she became pretty well known as a healer. Well, the pair lived in partnership and mutual affection. He was a white person for the next 20 years, and Morgan and Case together filed a homestead claim on the Rock Creek land near Phillipsburg. We have no idea really what Bertie's past was like. There's a book about her that is entirely fictionalized, but we do know that she was regarded as a healer. And it's really interesting because when the Forest Service was renovating her homestead cabin, they found her root bundle, and its contents were intact. She apparently carried African traditions with her to the Montana frontier. And the evidence, this is just absolutely a unique find. The contents of the bag are consistent with African-American bags that were carried by root doctors or healers. Someone in her past must have taught her this art. And it was, as they renovated the house or the cabin, it was the very last thing that the Forest Service found as they removed the door frame. So it was really quite a find. And these were the contents. There was a receipt for plums. There were 2 different types of cordage, one red and one natural. There was a wooden spatula and a soap wrapper. What these things might have been used for, we have no idea, but they are consistent with other root bundles that have been found in the South. So her restored cabin is a great place that you can actually rent from the Forest Service. When African-American communities were large enough, churches, as in white communities, provided a focus for social life. Some communities like Helena and Butte had both Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal congregations. Billings Wayman African Methodist Episcopal Chapel goes back to 1896 and is still a viable congregation. The St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church in Helena, which is now a private residence, had sufficient prestige to host the regional convention in 1894. Helena, like most urban areas in Montana, never experienced residential segregation. Whites and blacks in Helena and in most communities lived together. In Billings, however, city ordinance confined blacks to a South Side neighborhood. Although prejudice was obvious in social segregation, it was not always visually evident. James Presley Ball was a professional photographer. He and his son, J.P. Ball Jr., came from Cincinnati in 1887 and set up a studio. And also they edited The Colored Citizen, one of Montana's several African-American newspapers. They took some odd photos during their decade in Montana, as well as some that documented momentous events. They took many photos of immigrants of various ethnic groups, of prominent businessmen, society women, and families, as well as important events. But one record J.P. Ball left us is a bizarre sequence documenting the hanging of William Biggerstaff in Lewis and Clark County in April of 1896. This thoughtfully composed portrait, taken some time before Biggerstaff murdered a popular local prize fighter, is typical of the Ball's work. It shows a prominent, well-dressed gentleman with no hint of the horror soon to come. The photographer took this photograph with Sheriff Henry Juergens on the right and the Right Reverend Victor Day left with his hat removed, flanking Biggerstaff moments after his execution. Biggerstaff is wearing the same coat as in the previous photograph. And here he is wearing it again, looking strangely peaceful after his violent death. While some might view Biggerstaff's hanging as a miscarriage of justice due to racial bias, perhaps Ball had an entirely different message. Biggerstaff freely admitted his guilt, and he had a fair and impartial trial like any other citizen. Underscoring this point, Ball also documented the execution of a white man with his camera. J.P. Ball Jr., the son, was a noted attorney and had a daughter, Alice, who graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in pharmaceutical chemistry and then attended the University of Hawaii on a scholarship. In 1915, she became the first African-American woman to earn a master's degree from that university. During her graduate work, she developed a method for administering shalmugra oil intravenously. This oil had long been used as a treatment for Hansen's disease or leprosy, but it was very bitter and unpleasant and was difficult to convince patients to take it. Before Alice could publish this major breakthrough, she died in 1916 at the age of 24, perhaps from chlorine poisoning that occurred during her work. A colleague published her work and took the credit. Intravenous shalmugra oil treatments were used on patients into the 1940s. It was not until the year 2000 that the University of Hawaii finally recognized her important contribution. Buffalo soldiers at Fort Harrison in the 24th Infantry were among the soldiers that were stationed there after the Spanish-American War. One of those was Samuel Bridgewater, who also fought in the battle at San Juan Hill. Private Bridgewater was wounded in the right breast and also suffered from yellow fever, as did many soldiers who fought in that conflict. In 1902, he was reassigned to Fort Harrison, where he served as a cook. He's one of the two in the back. I believe he is probably the one on the right-hand side. In 1905, he retired and died in 1912 of complications from his service in the Spanish-American War. He left a wife and 5 children. His daughter, Octavia, graduated from the Lincoln School of Nursing in New York in 1930. This was one of only 2 nursing schools exclusively for African Americans. Octavia did private duty nursing and then joined the Army in 1943 and served during World War II. At this time, the Navy did not accept any Black nurses, and the Army had a quota of only 56. There were at the time 8,000 Black nurses in the United States, and Octavia was one of the 56 that was accepted. Well, these women realized that if the military situation was not rectified, Black nurses could never be integrated into the mainstream medical community. So nationally and through the Black press, the women mobilized for their cause. The Army and Navy finally lifted the boycott against Black nurses in 1945. Octavia earned the rank of first lieutenant and returned to Helena to work for St. Peter's Hospital for many, many years, probably its first Black employee. She was always proud that she was part of that national movement. Dr. John Walter Duncan was Butte's first Black physician. He began as a barber and editor of the New Age, one of several papers targeted at African-American communities. Duncan, like many Black barbers, also practiced podiatry. But when that became a recognized medical profession, Duncan left his family in Butte for medical school and graduated in 1920 from the Massachusetts School of Podiatry. He practiced for many years, and later his son also graduated from podiatry school and practiced with him. Dr. Duncan was a founder of what is now the Montana Podiatric Medical Association. The daughter of the younger Dr. Duncan, Joan, grew up in Butte and moved to Helena, where she served several terms on the city council. She once said, and I quote, "For most of my life, the only Black face I see is the face I see in the mirror in the morning. But I have not suffered the kinds of prejudice as many of the other people I've known who have lived here. I'm not saying it wasn't here. I'm just saying it wasn't directed at me." The Crump family has been prominent in Montana for 5 generations. James served in the Union Army at 14 and was the youngest Civil War veteran in Montana. He hauled freight for Charles Broadwater and owned mines in Marysville, and then operated a saloon in Helena and did very well for himself. He was proud to have held the flag at the laying of the Capitol's cornerstone. James's wife, Clarissa Powell Crump, was a Montana pioneer also. She was born a slave in Virginia and came west with her owner, Phil Evans. En route to Fort Benton on the steamboat Lily Martin, she learned of the emancipation. She and James Crump were married in 1869. Clarissa was very involved in social clubs and events. The Crump's home in Helena sheltered 3 generations of the Crump and Howard families. The house is listed in the National Register and it's still a neighborhood landmark. Members of the Crump family continue to live and work in Helena today. The Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs organized in the 1920s and was a very vibrant, active organization across the state. The Black Montana communities were close-knit and enjoyed large regional gatherings of several hundred people at a time. They were sort of like family reunions. The Great Falls today has the largest African-American population because of the Air Force Base at Malmstrom. Its early African-American community founded the Union Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1890 and built a church in 1916. The congregation swelled in the 1940s and has again recently swelled again with Black soldiers stationed at Malmstrom. In 1952, the Cascade County Community Council appointed the Interracial Committee to study discrimination against Black airmen who were not allowed into many Great Falls businesses. As an exception was the far-famed Ozark Club. The club burned in 1962, but until then, it was unique to the state because it employed integrated jazz bands and hosted an interracial clientele. One prominent Great Falls African-American woman was Alma Jacobs, who grew up in Lewistown. In 1957, she was elected the first Black president of the Pacific Northwest Library Association. In 1973, she co-founded the Montana Committee for the Humanities, and in 1974, she was appointed Montana's state librarian. Alma was instrumental in building the modern Great Falls Public Library, and patrons erected this memorial in her honor. She was recently inducted into the Hall of Outstanding Montanans in the state capitol. Now, the first 2 women to serve in the Montana legislature were elected in 1917, but the first African-American Montanan to serve was also a woman. While her husband was stationed at Malmstrom, voters elected Geraldine Travis of Great Falls to the House of Representatives in 1973. The Montana's Black population has made small gains in numbers in recent years. We historians hope that youngsters like Nathan Jones here of Great Falls will learn about his family's own heritage, explore his roots and those of his community, and pass on what he learns to his own children. Black Montanans have made important contributions to their communities, and even so, sometimes lived lonely lives as small minorities. But as their histories begin to unfold and we begin to understand their hardships and their rich legacies, their stories fill an important missing chapter in the history of our state. It's an honorable history and a legacy that is well worth remembering. So I don't know if I can take questions.
You can take questions. If people have questions, please put them in the chat box or use the Q&A feature, and we will read those out. That was so informative. That was awesome. Thank you, Ellen.
You're welcome.
I walk by that Samuel Lewis house.
Oh, isn't it
all
wonderful?
the time. Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah. Well, there's just so much more I could tell. I have to limit everything, you know. But it is, we're just beginning to learn such wonderful stories.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And as a librarian, I do know about Alma Jacobs.
Of course you do. Yeah.
We love Alma.
Yeah, she was quite a wonderful person. And her nephew, Alan Thompson, just recently passed away. And he was such a wonderful guy. He collected the histories of Black cowboys and just had some wonderful stories to tell. It was really quite a loss.
Well, if anybody in our audience has questions, please. I'm sure Ellen is a fountain of knowledge.
Nobody wants to ask any questions.
Well, we got a shy bunch, I guess. Well, it's now or forever hold your peace. Otherwise, we'll let you get on with your Wednesday evening.
All right. Well, thank you all, for those of you out there, for listening. And thank you for hosting me.
Yes, thanks again. It's always wonderful to hear a presentation from you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Well, everybody.
Hope to see you again. Well, not see you, but hear you anyway.
All right. Well, everybody take care. And thanks again, Ellen and Humanities Montana.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.